You never truly realize how much you don't belong until the silence speaks louder than the words ever could. The house feels still, almost too still, as though it is holding its breath, waiting for something to break the quiet. The soft hum of the refrigerator is the loudest sound in the room, a reminder of the ordinary, the mundane, the constant backdrop to something that feels wrong. The family is gathered, but the spaces between them are more than physical. They are palpable, as if invisible walls separate them. The kitchen, where they once shared meals together, now feels like a place where shadows linger, too thick to cross. The chairs are arranged as they always have been, but today, they feel foreign, out of place, as if the seating arrangement itself is a reminder of what's been lost. One chair sits empty at the table, the one that should have been for her, but instead it is just an awkward gap, a sign of her absence. Her eyes flicker over it, then away, unwilling to acknowledge what it represents. The others continue to talk, but it's not really conversation, it's just noise. No one looks her way, no one seeks her opinion, and yet, she plays her part, responding in kind, offering the expected smiles, the polite nods. She moves about the room with mechanical precision, carrying dishes, refilling cups, the movements of someone who has perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. She doesn't need to be asked to do these things, of course. She's always been the one to step in, to fill the gaps, but today it feels different. There's a subtle weight in the air, heavier than usual, as though she's no longer even meant to be here. The realization doesn't come all at once, but in pieces. A forgotten word, a moment of silence when she expected to be included, a glance exchanged between the others that she's not a part of. Her place in this family has never been secure, but now, it's clearer than ever. She's been left out, not by accident, but by design. They've moved on without her, and she's been too blind to see it until now. As she sets the glass on the table, her fingers tremble, just slightly, betraying the calm she tries to maintain. The weight of it all presses down on her, not with anger, but with something quieter, humiliation. It's the realization that she's no longer needed, that her sacrifices, her years of effort, have gone unnoticed, or worse, have been taken for granted. She can't stop it, can't stop the way her heart races as she looks around, seeing them all so comfortable, so connected, and she's just here. Not part of it. Not really. The ache is subtle at first, a tightening in her chest, the creeping feeling that she's been forgotten, left behind. She shifts her gaze to the family, seeing them laugh, seeing them share inside jokes she hasn't been a part of for years. And for a moment, she wonders how long it's been this way, how long she's been standing on the outside looking in. Her throat tightens as she turns away, retreating into the kitchen, the last refuge where she can pretend she's still a part of something, even if it's only in the most superficial sense. But as she stands there, alone, in the cold light of the kitchen, the truth hits her with an undeniable clarity. She's been pushed out. She's been left behind. And there's no going back. The family she once knew, the place she once held, is no longer hers. It's a painful realization, but also a freeing one. The first breath she takes in the silence of the kitchen is deep, heavy, as if she's finally accepting something she's long refused to see. Her hands stop shaking. The weight of the moment isn't lost on her. She knows what this means. She knows the place she once called home no longer welcomes her. She knows now that it's time to walk away from the family that never truly saw her, never truly cared. And for the first time in years, she feels something stir inside her, a quiet resolve, an understanding that it's time to take control. It's time to stop pretending she belongs where she's no longer wanted. It's time to let go. The evening light filters through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The house feels quiet, almost unnervingly so, as the family settles into their routines, each person occupying their designated space, both physically and emotionally. The couch, where they used to sit together, now feels like a distant island in the middle of a sea of tension. The mother-in-law, sitting in her usual spot, watches. The family with a careful distance, her eyes moving from one face to another, never lingering too long. It's as though she's observing a world she no longer belongs to, a world she's been pushed to the periphery of. She remains silent, though her silence speaks louder than words ever could. The children chatter away, their voices filling the room, but when they look at her, There's something almost dismissive in their gaze, something unspoken in the way their eyes quickly move away, like they've seen her but don't truly acknowledge her presence. The seat next to her, once a space filled with conversation, is now empty, the cushion slightly indented where someone had sat there once. She notices it every time she turns her head, that empty space beside her. It's a small thing, a detail that could easily go unnoticed, but it weighs on her heavily, as if the seat itself is a reminder of her growing irrelevance in the family's dynamic. As the dinner progresses, she catches a fleeting glance from her daughter-in-law across the table. It's not an overt gesture, but the way the daughter-in-law looks away quickly, averting her gaze, is enough to make her heart tighten. It's a small act, an unspoken dismissal, but it stings nonetheless. The conversation continues, but her voice feels like it's no longer needed. She tries to join in, offering a casual remark about the food, but the words hang in the air, ignored. The others continue speaking over her, their laughter rising above her, as though she's no longer a part of the conversation. She can't help but notice the slight shift in her position at the table, the way the family has subtly restructured the seating arrangements. Her place at the head of the table, once central and important, has been relegated to the corner. She doesn't say anything, doesn't object, but the discomfort is impossible to ignore. The shift in her place is not just physical, it's symbolic. The power dynamic has subtly shifted, and she's been moved aside, not in an overt confrontation, but in the quiet way things have changed. The dinner continues, and she remains mostly silent, the weight of her realization pressing down on her chest. She watches as the conversation flows around her, her voice no longer needed, her presence fading into the background. Her role has been reduced to that of an observer, someone who no longer has a stake in the family's decisions or discussions. She glances at the children, laughing, comfortable, and suddenly the gap between them feels too wide to cross. The family, once a unit, has become fragmented, and she's been left standing on the outside. The air feels thicker now, heavier, as if the room itself is closing in on her. She wants to speak up, to demand acknowledgement, but the words die in her throat. She's learned over the years to keep her feelings to herself, to remain in the background, to let the others take center stage. But tonight, it's different. The silence between them is no longer comfortable, no longer a shared understanding. It's an absence, an emptiness that stretches further with each passing moment. The meal ends, and the family disperses. She stands, the last to leave the table, gathering the dishes with slow, deliberate movements. As she carries the dishes into the kitchen, she feels the weight of the moment settle around her. The house is quiet again, but this time, the silence feels final. She realizes then that she no longer belongs here, not in the way she once did. She's been left behind, not with a grand gesture, but with 1,000 small ones that have piled up over time. And as she washes the dishes alone in the kitchen, the feeling settles into her bones. She's not part of this family anymore. She's not even sure she ever truly was. She remembers a summer evening, the warmth of the air lingering as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a golden light that felt like a promise. The family had gathered in the backyard, the children running around, the scent of grilled food wafting through the air, and laughter filling the space. It was supposed to be a simple moment of togetherness, one of those rare times when everything seemed perfect. She had stood at the edge of the patio, watching them, feeling the familiar comfort of being part of something bigger, of being included. Her husband had been sitting at the table, his back turned toward her, talking to their son. She had approached him, carrying a plate of food, ready to offer it with a smile. But as she got closer, she saw the way he subtly shifted his position, moving just enough to leave the space beside him empty. It wasn't an overt gesture, just a slight adjustment of his body, but it spoke volumes. Her heart tightened, though she didn't show it. She placed the plate on the table and took the chair across from him, choosing to ignore the way her presence seemed less necessary, less wanted. The conversation flowed around her, but she was left on the outside, a peripheral figure in what should have been a family moment. The children didn't look at her much, their attention consumed by their father, by the food, by the warmth of the evening. She smiled, of course, because that was what was expected, but her smile felt heavy, weighted with the realization that something had changed. The moment passed quickly, as all things do, but the feeling lingered, a whisper she couldn't quite shake. The subtle shift, the way the family had subtly moved without her, without a word spoken, was becoming more apparent with each passing day. It was as if, in that small moment, they had unknowingly confirmed what she had feared. She no longer belonged in the center of their lives. The conversations that once included her now moved around her, like she was simply an observer, a witness to the life that she used to be an integral part of. She had been so caught up in the comfort of familiarity that she hadn't noticed the growing distance between them, hadn't realized that the love she once felt had begun to fray at the edges. But in that moment, as she stood at the table, trying to participate in the conversation, she saw it clearly. She wasn't part of the inner circle anymore. The family dynamic had shifted so subtly, so quietly, that she hadn't realized it until it was too late. The small signs, her husband's subtle movements, the children's distracted glances, the space that was never quite left for her, had been there all along, but she hadn't wanted to see them. She hadn't wanted to acknowledge that she was slowly being pushed aside. The warmth of the evening, the laughter, the food, all of it felt hollow now, a reminder of what she once had and what she no longer could reach. It was as though she was fading from their lives, no longer essential, no longer needed. She stood up from the table, unable to stay in the quiet discomfort any longer. The evening continued without her, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting into the background as she retreated inside. She set the plate down, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron, the weight of her own realization sinking in. She had been so wrapped up in the idea of family, in the hope that nothing had changed, that she had failed to see the distance growing between them. The empty chair at the table, the unspoken shift in the air, those small things, the things she had dismissed, were now all she could see. The truth settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't part of them anymore. She was something else, something less. It was a Saturday afternoon, the house humming with the usual bustle. The smell of freshly baked cookies wafted through the air, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning supplies from the morning. The children were scattered around the living room, their laughter punctuating the otherwise serene atmosphere. But there was a silence that settled between the mother and daughter-in-law. The family had gathered for what seemed like a normal afternoon, but the space between them felt weighted. The mother-in-law, once the center of attention at these gatherings, had now found herself lingering at the edges of the room, an observer rather than a participant. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same place she had sat countless times before, but today, it felt different. Her daughter-in-law walked past her without a glance, the soft shuffle of her steps on the hardwood floor almost too loud in the stillness. She stopped at the counter, preparing a snack for the children, but never once did she turn to acknowledge her. The mother-in-law looked at the counter, then at her daughter-in-law's back, wondering if it was intentional or if she was just imagining the distance. The children, oblivious to the tension, continued their play, occasionally glancing at their mother for approval, but never at her. She wasn't included in the conversations, nor was she needed for any decisions. As the afternoon wore on, the family settled around the dining table for a light meal. The mother-in-law stood to serve, as she always had, but when she reached for the platter, her daughter-in-law subtly nudged her aside, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let me do it," she said, her tone too sweet, too practiced. The mother-in-law stepped back without protest, but the sting was undeniable. It wasn't the words, nor the gesture, but the way it was done. Casual, almost as though it were expected, as if her role in this family had already been redefined without her even realizing it. She watched as her daughter-in-law expertly arranged the food, taking charge of the moment with a confidence that the mother-in-law had once held. The children praised her, their voices filled with admiration, while she remained silent, her hands still on the platter she had once been trusted to serve. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet realization that had begun to settle deep within her. She had been replaced, not with anger or confrontation, but with subtlety, with the kind of quiet manipulation that left no room for argument. The family continued to eat, the conversation flowing freely, but it was as though she had become an invisible presence in her own home. The mother-in-law glanced around the table, her eyes moving from face to face, searching for something, recognition, perhaps, or a sense of belonging. but all she found were vacant smiles, polite gestures. She smiled back, but it was a hollow thing, a mask she wore to hide the growing ache in her chest. The evening passed, and she didn't speak much. The family's laughter filled the room, but it didn't reach her. It never had, not in the way it once had when she was at the center of their lives. Now, she sat quietly in the corner, pretending to be part of something she no longer belonged to. The soft murmur of the family continued, but the silence between them felt louder than any word ever could. She could feel it. The distance, the separation, the unspoken exclusion. The signs had always been there, subtle at first, but now they were undeniable. She had been quietly, carefully pushed aside, replaced by a new order, a new dynamic. It wasn't a confrontation, not a fight or an argument, but the constant, steady erosion of her place in this family. And as she sat there, listening to the laughter that seemed so far away, she realized that she had been watching it happen for months, even years, and had done nothing but silently accept it, telling herself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But now, the truth was clear. She was no longer part of this family center, and it hurt in a way that words could never fully express. She had always been the one to keep the family together, the invisible thread that tied them all. But as time passed, she began to feel the thread unraveling, slowly at first, then all at once. It was a quiet shift, almost imperceptible, like the gradual erosion of a foundation that once seemed unbreakable. One evening, as they sat together around the dinner table, the weight of it hit her. She had made the meal, as she always did, but this time, it felt different. The food was laid out, but the usual gratitude, the thanks, the appreciation, was absent. Her son barely glanced at her as he dug into his plate, his focus instead on his wife, who sat beside him, laughing at a joke only they understood. It was subtle, but it stung. She wasn't just being ignored. She was being erased, slowly pushed to the edges of the family's world. She had seen it before, but never as clearly as now. The moments of neglect, the polite gestures that didn't reach their eyes, the way the family seemed to function without her, as if she had never been a central part of it. The realization that it wasn't just neglect, that it wasn't just a series of accidental oversights, hit her with a crushing clarity. It was intentional. They were pushing her out, little by little, without ever saying a word. Her role in the family had been gradually redefined. She had become the background, the one who no longer had a voice in the decisions, the one who was no longer needed. As the dinner continued, she found herself staring at the empty seat beside her, the one that used to be occupied by her late husband. She had always taken that seat for granted, assuming it was hers by right, a symbol of the place she held in the family. But now, it felt like a reminder of what she had lost. Her son no longer turned to her for advice, no longer asked for her opinion. Her daughter-in-law had taken on the role she had once held, making decisions without consulting her, guiding the family in ways she once had. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift had become a full-blown truth. She had been replaced. The weight of the realization pressed down on her chest. Her place in this family had been taken from her, and she had been left behind. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that it wasn't personal, that they were just growing up, that things had to change. But deep down, she knew the truth. They didn't need her anymore. She had been cast aside, not with a grand gesture, but with the quiet, slow erasure of her role. The family continued to live, to function, to laugh, to love, but it was all happening without her. She had become a ghost in her own home, a shadow of the woman she once was. The silence between them grew, not in anger, but in resignation. She sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, and watched as they continued, their lives moving on without her. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The truth was clear now, and it hurt in a way that words could never capture. She had been replaced. She had been made irrelevant. And there was no room for her in this new family dynamic. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, but to her, it felt like everything shifted in an instant. The family was gathered in the living room, the same place they always sat, the same room filled with the same chatter. But today, the air felt heavier, more suffocating. The conversation continued as usual, but the words that passed between them no longer held the warmth they once did. She stood by the window, looking outside, feeling the familiar tug of longing for something that no longer existed. Her daughter-in-law, ever so polite, asked if she needed help with the dishes, her voice too sweet, too measured. It was a question that should have been simple, but there was something in the way it was said, something distant, something that felt like an afterthought. She smiled softly, almost too quietly, and replied, "No, I'm fine." It wasn't the question that hurt. It was the way it was asked, like she was a guest, not a part of this family anymore. As the family moved on, she watched them, her hand still resting on the windowsill. She didn't move. Her son and daughter-in-law were laughing, their voices blending together in a harmony that felt so foreign to her now. The children played in the corner, their attention fixed on their parents. She was there, but not really. She wasn't part of the laughter, the easy camaraderie. She felt like an outsider, a shadow standing in a space that once felt like home. Then it came, her son's voice, calling out to her. "Mom, could you make some more coffee? We're almost out." The words were casual, but there was an undertone, a subtle dismissal that echoed in her ears. She felt the sting, but she didn't say anything. She didn't even respond. She simply turned away, walking to the kitchen with a slow, measured pace. It was as if, in that one moment, the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. She was no longer the center of this family. She was no longer needed. She had been replaced, not with a harsh word, but with 1,000 small actions, 1,000 moments like this one, where she was no longer seen, no longer valued. She poured the coffee into the pot, her hands steady, though her chest tightened. The sound of the coffee dripping into the carafe filled the room, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of her thoughts. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even sad. She was just numb. The truth had been staring her in the face for months, but she had refused to acknowledge it. She had convinced herself that things would change, that this was just a phase. But now, standing in the kitchen, the weight of it was undeniable. She was no longer the matriarch, the guiding force in the family. She had been quietly edged out, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The coffee finished brewing, and she poured herself a cup, holding it in her hands like it was the only thing left in her world that hadn't shifted beneath her. She stood there for a moment, staring out the window, watching as the world outside carried on, unaware of the quiet devastation unfolding inside. The family, the people she had given everything for, were moving on without her, and there was no place for her in their future. She took a deep breath, the warm mug pressed to her lips, and for the first time, she allowed herself to accept it. She had been pushed aside, not with anger or malice, but with the soft, insidious force of indifference. And in that quiet moment, she understood. She was no longer a part of this family. She had been replaced. She sat in the living room, the soft hum of the house filling the space around her. But there was a profound silence in her mind, a void that had only grown since that moment in the kitchen. The family continued their routine, but it was as though she no longer existed within it. The children laughed, running past her, but never stopping to talk to her, never seeking her attention. She observed them, her hands folded in her lap, as they moved through their world without her. It wasn't that she was angry, or even resentful. It was the quiet resignation that had settled in her chest, the certainty that nothing could ever return to the way it once was. Her place had been taken, her role rewritten without her consent. As the evening wore on, she found herself in the kitchen again, standing at the sink, washing the dishes. The motion of scrubbing the plates, the repetition of it, felt almost meditative, but also futile. Each plate, each cup she cleaned seemed to be another part of her life she was trying to hold on to, but it slipped through her fingers. She didn't need to speak to them anymore. They had stopped asking for her help a long time ago. No one seemed to notice how much time she spent in that kitchen, how she lingered over the mundane tasks, filling the space with her quiet movements. The room was unchanged, but she saw it now for what it had become, a place where she was no longer needed, where the echoes of her past role hung in the air, fading with every task she performed without acknowledgement. She placed the last dish on the drying rack and looked around the room. The kitchen had always been hers, her domain. She had spent countless hours in here, cooking meals, cleaning, creating a home. But now it felt like a foreign space. The sounds of the family, their voices and laughter, came to her from the other side of the house, distant, unreachable. She stood still for a moment, her eyes lingering on the counter, the same counter she had stood at for years, preparing meals for a family that no longer seemed to care. The thought of walking into the living room, joining them, crossed her mind briefly, but she didn't. It wasn't that she wasn't welcome, it was that she didn't belong. The family was no longer hers to be a part of. She had been quietly and thoroughly replaced, and no amount of cleaning, no amount of service, could change that. She let out a slow breath, the weight of the realization pressing down on her chest, and walked out of the kitchen without a word. As she passed through the hallway, she glanced into the living room. They were all there, together, laughing, sharing stories. She could see them, but it was as if they couldn't see her. She moved on, walking to her bedroom, and closed the door behind her. The silence in the room felt like a comfort, the only space left where she wasn't reminded of what she had lost. She sat on the edge of the bed, the stillness of the house now enveloping her completely. Her place in this family had been taken, and the world outside her room continued without her. The thought echoed in her mind, and for the first time, she allowed herself to accept it. She no longer had a place here. She no longer had a role to play, and she was finally beginning to understand that there was no going back. She sat at the small desk in her bedroom, the soft light from the lamp casting a quiet glow over the papers in front of her. Her hands moved slowly, methodically, as she went through the documents, one by one. There was no rush, no urgency in her actions, just a quiet resolve. The papers were neatly arranged before her, each one representing a part of her life she had once thought she would never need to take back. But now, in the stillness of this room, it all felt necessary. She didn't need anyone's approval or acknowledgement anymore. The family had moved on without her, and she had finally accepted that. She no longer sought to return to the position she once held. The truth had settled in, and with it came the clarity that had eluded her for so long. She wasn't looking for reconciliation or recognition. What she sought now was control, the control that had been taken from her so quietly, so subtly over the years. She signed the papers without hesitation, each stroke of the pen a small act of reclaiming the power that had been stripped away. She didn't need to tell anyone. The decision had been made, and it was hers to keep. The family continued to live their lives, but now, she would no longer be a passive observer. As she finished the paperwork, she placed the documents in a folder, her movements deliberate and calm. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture, just the quiet act of preparing for what was to come. The family's world, which had once revolved around her, now seemed distant, disconnected. She looked around her room, her gaze lingering on the familiar items that once held so much meaning. But they no longer had the same hold over her. The emotional weight of the house, of the family, had lessened. She had made her choice. The decision to step back, to let go, was no longer a source of pain. It was liberating. She wasn't the woman she once was, and the family she had once tried so hard to hold together wasn't the same either. The roles had shifted, the dynamic had changed, and there was no going back. She rose from the desk and placed the folder in a drawer, locking it away. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. It felt like the beginning of something new, something for her, something that didn't require the approval or acceptance of anyone else. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to ask for permission. The family had moved on, and now, so would she. Not with anger or regret, but with a quiet sense of purpose, a quiet resolve. The house, the people, the life she once knew, they were no longer the center of her world. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was finally in control again. She stood in front of the family home, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, now felt distant, almost foreign. She had spent so many years within these walls, pouring everything into a role she no longer wanted, no longer needed. The weight of it all had shifted from her shoulders, and now there was nothing left to hold her here. The papers had been signed, the decisions made, and yet there was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration. Just the quiet knowledge that things had changed, irrevocably. She took a deep breath, standing there for a moment, feeling the cool evening air brush against her skin. The noise of the family inside, their chatter, their laughter, was distant now, like a song she no longer recognized. She didn't feel the need to be a part of it anymore. She had let go, and with that release, came a strange sense of freedom. No longer tethered to their expectations, to the role they had assigned her, she was free to walk away. Without a word, she turned and walked to her car, the engine starting up with a soft hum. pulling away from the driveway for what felt like the first time in years. The house faded in her rearview mirror, its shape growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing more than a distant memory. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need to prove her worth to them. As the road stretched out before her, she felt a calm settle over her, a quiet certainty that she had made the right choice. No longer defined by the past, by the role she had played in their lives, she was free to forge her own path. The weight of the years spent in service, in silence, had been lifted, and now, for the first time, she was able to breathe. She wasn't going back. The house, the family, the life she had known, it was all behind her now. She didn't need to explain, didn't need to justify the decision. The truth was clear. Her value wasn't defined by their acceptance. Her worth was her own. As she drove into the night, the last traces of the life she had left behind faded into the distance, and with it, she felt something inside her shift. She was no longer a shadow in her own life. She was herself, fully, entirely. And for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. Have you ever had to walk away from something you thought you'd never leave behind? What did it take for you to realize you were finally free?